Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a fascinating dive ahead of us thanks to the sources you've shared. We are cracking open a foundational text, one that, well, it really sets the stage for so much Western thought. Aristotle's The Categories.
It really does.
Imagine trying to figure out the most basic possible ways you can think about, talk about, or even be something. That's pretty much the challenge he takes on here.
Starting from scratch, almost.
Our mission for this deep dive is to explore Aristotle's fundamental building blocks, how he looks at words, how he sees things existing, and then how he sorts, well, absolutely everything into fundamental types or categories.
Get ready for some classic philosophical aha moments, I think.
Yeah, because these ancient ideas, they still frame how we think today, you know?
They really do. It really is starting from zero, asking how language hooks onto reality. Aristotle is incredibly precise, beginning with how names work before getting to the things they name.
Right. He starts right there looking at how we use words. Like the difference between calling a real man and a drawing of a man, both animal. That's his first distinction. Equivocally.
Same name, totally different definition underneath. A picture isn't alive in the same way a man is, obviously.
Exactly. And then the straightforward one, univocally.
Right. Same name and the same definition. Like a man and an ox, both called animal, and they share the core definition of animality. Simple enough.
And the third way is derivatively. The name comes from another word, like grammarian from grammar.
Or courageous from courage. The form changes slightly, but the root concept is clear. It's about that relationship between the words.
These different ways of naming things, they sort of set the stage for how we combine words then.
Yes. He distinguishes between simple expressions, just single words like man or runs, and composite expressions, which are phrases or sentences like the man runs.
And here's a crucial logical point he makes. Simple terms can't be true or false.
Right. You can't just say man and evaluate its truth value.
But composite expressions can be true or false, depending on whether they match reality. The man runs is either true or it's false.
Right. This moves us from language to existence itself. Aristotle then asks, how do things exist in relation to a subject? He identifies 4 patterns here.
Yep.
The first is something that can be predicated of a subject, but is never present in a subject. Think of man. You predicate man of an individual man. You say Socrates is a man.
Right.
But the concept man isn't in Socrates the way, say, whiteness is in his skin.
Okay, so man is what Socrates is, but not something in him. Got it. What's the second pattern?
Something present in a subject but never predicable of a subject. Like a specific piece of grammatical knowledge is present in a mind. Whiteness is present in a body.
And he's careful to note present in doesn't mean like a part of something.
Exactly. Not like a hand is part of a body. It means something that cannot exist independently of that subject. Whiteness needs something white to be in. It can't just float around on its own.
That distinction is subtle, but sounds really important for his system. Okay, third.
Third, something can be both predicable of a subject and present in a subject. Knowledge as a general concept is present in the mind, but you can also predicate knowledge of something specific, like saying grammar is knowledge.
I see. Both applies there. And then the fourth one. This seems like the most fundamental based on the sources, neither present in a subject nor predicable of a subject.
Precisely. This is where we find the individual concrete things. Your specific dog, that particular tree, the individual Socrates you mentioned, they are the bedrock.
Everything else is either said of them or is in them.
That's the idea. This leads directly to his concept of substance, the foundation of everything.
Right. So those individual things we just mentioned, the individual man, the individual horse, those are substance in the primary, most proper sense.
Yes, exactly. They are the ultimate subjects. He argues that if these individual primary substances didn't exist, nothing else could. Qualities like white, quantities like 3 cubits long, relations like double, they all depend on substances existing first.
They really are the basic building blocks of reality itself, then.
They are, for Aristotle. Then he has secondary substances.
Okay.
These aren't individuals, but the species and genera that include the primary substances. Man as a species includes all individual men. Animal as a genus includes the species man.
So the species and genera are like the classifications for those primary substances.
You got it. And they are predicable of primary substances. You say Socrates is a man or Socrates is an animal.
But they are not present in primary substances in the way equality is.
Correct. Man isn't in Socrates like whiteness is in his skin. It's what he is, fundamentally.
And he argues the species, like man, is a more true secondary substance than the genus, animal. Why is that?
Because the species is closer to the individual primary substance. It gives a more specific, a more informative definition of what that individual is.
Okay. Saying Socrates is a man tells you more than saying he's an animal.
Exactly. It's a step closer to the individual reality. He even says the species is to the genus as subject is to predicate the species is more fundamental in explaining the individual.
Okay, so primary are the individuals, secondary are the classifications, species, then genera. He gives some key marks of substance, too, to help pin it down.
Yes, ways to identify it. One is that it's never present in a subject, which we've discussed.
Right, clear for primary substances, and for secondary, like man or animal, they're predicated of the individual, not present in them.
Right. He does note things like a hand or head might seem like parts present in a subject, but he argues they are substances themselves, parts of a substance, and not present as in the subject in his very specific technical sense. It's a tricky point.
And secondary substances and differentiate, the things that distinguish species within a genus, like rational for man, they're predicated univocally.
Yes, they apply with the same definition across the individuals or species they are predicated of. Substance also gives the impression of signifying the individual. Primary substance is the individual.
And secondary substances?
Well, they seem to signify individuals because they name the kind of thing an individual is, like man or animal. This is different from a quality like white, which just names an attribute.
Another mark he gives is having no contrary. There's no opposite of an individual man or the species man or the genus animal.
True. They just are. Though, it's worth noting that other things, like quantities such as 2 cubits long, also lack contraries, so this isn't entirely unique to substance.
Good point. And substance doesn't admit a variation of degree. One man isn't more man than another man.
Correct. You can't be more of a specific individual or more of a species like human.
Unlike qualities, right? Like whiteness, which can be more or less intense.
Exactly. Which leads us to what he considers the most distinctive mark of substance, the one really unique to it.
What's that?
This is really fascinating. It's the ability, while remaining numerically one in the same entity, to admit contrary qualities. The same individual man can change from being pale to tan, from being hot to cold, from being good to bad. This change happens within the substance itself while it remains that same man.
Okay. Unlike, say, a statement like, he is sitting, that statement can be true now and false later, but the statement itself didn't change.
Right. The external reality did. The man stood up.
So the statement's truth changes because the substance, the man, changes.
Exactly. The substance's own capacity for internal change while remaining itself, that's its unique property, according to Aristotle.
Wow. Okay, this foundational understanding of substance, this bedrock, leads him to his famous system for sorting everything else then.
Yes, the 10 categories. These are the fundamental ways non-composite expressions, single words or concepts can signify something. They're the basic labels or predicates we can apply.
Like the fundamental ways we can describe what's going on or what something is.
Precisely. He lists them as substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, state, action, and affection. These are kind of like the 10 fundamental questions you can ask about something's nature or situation.
And back to the earlier point, none of these terms in isolation is true or false. White isn't true or false.
Right, but the man is white is.
Okay, so when you hear man, think substance. 2 cubits long is quantity.
White is quality. Double is relation. In the marketplace is place. Yesterday is time.
Lying is position. Shit like wearing shoes, that's state.
To lance is action. To be lanced is affection. Every simple description fits into one of these buckets, essentially.
Let's maybe dig into a few more of these. What about quantity? How does he break that down?
Sure. Quantity is about how much or how many. He first divides it into discrete and continuous.
Okay, discrete.
Discrete quantities have parts with no common boundary. Think number or speech. The number 2 and the number 3 are distinct units. Syllables in a sentence are separate bits.
Right, and continue.
Continuous quantities have parts that do share a boundary. Lines meet at points, surfaces meet at lines, solids meet at surfaces. Time and place are also considered continuous.
Makes sense.
He also considers the position of parts within a quantity. Lines, surfaces, solids, and space have parts with relative position. You can say where one part is in relation to another.
But not all quantities.
No. Numbers, time, and speech, he says, only have parts with relative order, not position. A past moment in time is gone, it doesn't abide. The number 3 comes after 2 in a sequence. but it doesn't have a physical spot relative to 2.
That's an interesting distinction, position versus just order. I hadn't thought of it quite like that.
It is quite subtle. He also distinguishes strict quantity from things we might call quantitative, but only secondarily, like calling a surface large.
How so?
Well, the actual surface area is the quantity. Large just describes the surface in relation to that quantity, usually comparing it to other surfaces.
Okay. And like substance, quantity generally doesn't have contraries. 3 cubits long doesn't have an opposite length.
Right. He notes that much and little might seem contrary, but he argues those are relative terms, depending on context, not pure quantities themselves.
And quantity also doesn't admit a variation of degree. One group of 3 isn't more 3 than another group of 3.
Correct. Philosophically, the number 3 itself is an absolute quantity. A specific instance of 3-ness is just 3.
And the unique mark of quantities are one like for substance?
Yes. Equality and inequality are predicated only of quantity. One line can be equal or unequal to another line. One number is equal or unequal to another.
Whereas qualities?
You compare qualities by similarity. One shade of white is like or unlike another shade of white. You don't typically say they are equal. So equality and inequality is the key test for quantity.
Okay, moving on to relation. These are concepts defined by reference to something else, right?
Exactly. Superior is defined by being superior over something. Double is the double of something. Lots of things fall into this. Habits, dispositions, knowledge, perception, they are all of or relative to something else.
And relatives have correlatives. Slave master, double half.
Yes. And he emphasizes that the definition has to be precise for the reciprocity to hold. A wing, he says, is relative to a winged creature, not just generically a bird, because, not all birds might fit the definition perfectly, or something else might have wings. You have to pin down the attribute that creates the necessary relationship.
That makes sense. Precision matters.
Yeah.
And correlatives often come into existence and cease existence simultaneously.
Often, yes. You can't have a master without a slave, or double without half existing at the same time. They imply each other.
But you mentioned an exception earlier. With knowledge.
Ah, yes. He notes the object of knowledge or perception seems different. The stone you perceive exists before you perceive it, potentially, and it can continue to exist if you stop perceiving it, or even if you cease to exist.
So the knowledge depends on the object.
But the object doesn't seem to depend on the knowledge in quite the same reciprocal way. Annihilating the object removes the possibility of knowing it, but annihilating the knowledge doesn't remove the object. It suggests a slight asymmetry there.
Interesting. He also touches on whether things that seem relative, like a hand being part of a body, are truly relatives in this category.
Right. And he concludes they aren't strictly relatives in this sense because you can understand what a hand is without necessarily knowing whose specific hand it is. The definition doesn't inherently require the correlative subject.
Okay.
And while general categories like knowledge as a whole might be relative knowledge of something, he says specific branches like grammar or music are actually qualities, defining what kind of knowledge it is rather than being relatives.
So things can potentially fit into more than one category, depending on how you look at them.
It seems so. Aristotle allows for that complexity, but he's always trying to find the primary, most fundamental category something belongs to based on its definition.
Okay, next big one, quality. What makes something such and such?
This describes the nature or characteristic of a thing. He lists 4 main types. First, habits and dispositions.
Habits like knowledge or virtue.
Exactly. Things that are lasting, difficult to change. Dispositions are more easily changed, like being hot or cold right now, or being healthy or sick.
So a habit is a kind of disposition.
Yes, habits are dispositions, but not all dispositions are habits. A habit is like a more ingrained, stable disposition.
Okay. Second type of quality.
Natural capacities or incapacities, like being naturally a good boxer or having a strong constitution, being naturally healthy or inherently sickly. It's about the inborn ability or lack thereof to do something easily or resist something easily.
Third type.
Affective qualities and affections. This is a bit broader. It covers things that produce sensation, like sweetness, heat, colors. It also covers the results of affections, like the color that comes from blushing or going pale. And it includes lasting psychic states, like being generally irascible versus temporary ones, like being irritated right now.
Yeah.
These qualities are what cause us or enable us to be affected in certain ways.
And the fourth type of quality.
Figure and shape being triangular, straight, curved, things like that. Although he does add a little note that things like rarity and density or roughness and smoothness might seem like qualities.
Wow.
But they might relate more to the relative position of the parts of a thing, hinting back perhaps at quantity or even position, rather than being pure qualities. Again, he's trying to be precise.
Like substance, quality can have contraries, right? Justice, injustice, white, black.
Yes. Often one quality is the contrary of another. If one is a quality, the other typically is too, though not always. Some colors might not have a direct contrary.
Inequalities generally admit a variation of degree.
Yes. Something can be more or less white or more or less just. He does get into a subtle debate about whether it's the quality itself that varies or just our possession of it, but the basic idea is that these characteristics can have different intensities.
Except maybe figure and shape. A triangle is a triangle.
Generally, yes. Figure and shape are usually seen as absolutes in this system, not admitting of more or less.
And the most distinctive mark of quality.
Likeness and unlikeness. He says things are judged to be like or unlike only with reference to their qualities. That's the definitive test for this category.
Okay, so we have substance, the what it is, quantity, how much, quality, what kind of, and relation, what it's related to. What about the others briefly? Action and affection.
Right. The remaining categories mostly describe a thing's circumstances or state. Action is what something is doing, to lance, to cut, to heat. Affection, sometimes called passion, is what is being done to it, to be lanced, to be cut, to be heated.
And these can have contraries and vary in degree, too.
Yes, heating is contrary to cooling. Being heated can happen more or less intensely.
Then position, place, time, and state.
Position is how something is arranged spatially, lying, sitting. Place is simply where it is, in the Lyceum, in the marketplace. Time is when it is, yesterday, last year. And state, sometimes called having in a specific sense, is its condition related to what it's wearing or equipped with, shod-armed.
So these categories capture the more dynamic or circumstantial aspects of existence.
Exactly. They round out the 10 fundamental ways Aristotle thought we could describe something that exists.
Okay, that gives us the 10 buckets. He then shifts gears slightly to look at different ways things can stand in opposition to each other. 4 main senses of opposite.
Yes. First, as correlatives, which we've already seen, they are opposite in the sense that they define each other, like double and half, knowledge, and the thing known.
Second, as contraries. These are concepts that are maximally different within the same kind of thing, but they aren't defined by reference to each other, like good and bad, white and black.
Right, and some contraries have intermediates like gray between white and black. Others are exhaustive within a subject that can possess them. In an animal's body, it's either healthy or diseased. A number is either odd or even. One or the other must apply if the subject is receptive.
And change is possible between contraries.
Usually, yes, unless one is an essential property, like fire necessarily being hot.
Third type of opposition, privatives and positives.
Right. This refers to a natural state and its absence in the subject that ought to have it. Blindness and sight in the eye. It's not just any absence, but absence where presence is natural or expected.
Like you wouldn't call a rock blind.
Exactly. Or his example. You don't call a newborn kitten toothless in the sense of lacking its adult teeth yet. The potential isn't fully there. Privation implies the natural capacity has been lost or thwarted.
So they aren't correlatives, and not exactly like contraries either.
Correct. Change is usually one way, from possession to privation, like losing sight. Regaining sight naturally after blindness is less common than, say, going from hot to cold and back again.
And the fourth sense of opposite, affirmatives and negatives.
This applies specifically to propositions, statements like, he sits and he does not sit.
And this is where he makes a really key logical point.
Absolutely critical. Only in this case, the case of an affirmative and its corresponding negative proposition, is it necessary for one of the opposites to be true and the other false. Always, and regardless of whether the subject even exists.
Socrates sits and Socrates does not sit cannot both be true or both false at the same time.
Exactly. This is different from simple terms, which aren't true-false anyway, or even composite statements using contraries or privatives. Socrates is healthy and Socrates is sick could both be false if Socrates doesn't exist. But Socrates exists and Socrates does not exist. One must be true, one false.
That really highlights the unique logical status of propositions.
Yeah.
Powerful idea.
It is. Foundational for logic. He also throws in a side note on the contrary of good and evil. The contrary of a good is always evil, health, disease.
But the contrary of an evil.
Can be good, disease, health, or sometimes also evil, Think of defect and excess like cowardice and rashness. Both are evils, and the mean courage is the good contrary to both.
Interesting nuance. Okay, next he looks at different ways things can be prior and simultaneous, ordering existence and concepts beyond just simple time.
Right. Prior has several senses. The most obvious one is priority in time, just being older or more ancient.
But he goes deeper, like priority and sequence of being.
Yes. If the posterior thing exists, the prior thing must also exist, but not necessarily the other way around. His example is 1 is prior to 2. If 2 exists, 1 must exist, but 1 can exist without 2.
Okay. There's also priority and order.
Like the elements of geometry coming before the theorems built from them, or letters coming before syllables and words in language, or the introduction before the main body of a speech.
Right, and a sense of natural priority.
Meaning better or more honorable. He mentions this but finds it a bit less rigorous, more subjective maybe.
And finally, priority as cause.
Yes. The existence of the actual man is the cause of the truth of the proposition the man exists, even though the implication goes both ways logically. If the statement is true, the man exists. The reality is causally prior to the true statement about it.
Makes sense. And simultaneous. What are the different ways things can be simultaneous?
First, simply simultaneous genesis coming into being at the very same moment in time. Neither is prior or posterior temporally.
Okay. Second.
Simultaneous in nature. This is where the being of one thing requires the being of the other and vice versa, but neither is the cause of the other's existence, like double and half.
Ah, they necessarily exist together if they exist at all?
Exactly. You can't have one without the other, but the existence of double doesn't cause the existence of half. They are interdependent concepts.
And the third sense of simultaneous.
Species within the same genus that are distinguished by the same method of division, like winged animals, terrestrial animals, and water animals, all species under the genus animal divided by locomotion maybe. They are simultaneous in nature relative to each other as coordinate species.
Though the genus animal itself is prior to all of them.
Correct. The genus is prior to the species it contains.
He also briefly lists the 6 sorts of movement or change. What were they again?
Generation, coming into being, destruction, ceasing to be, increased growth, diminution, shrinking, alteration, change in quality, and change of place, locomotion.
And rest is the contrary of motion.
Yes. And specific contraries exist for some types of motion. Destruction is contrary to generation, diminution to increase, rest in a place is contrary to changing place, and so on.
And alteration, the change of quality, is seen as a distinct kind of motion.
Right. Its contrary is either remaining in the same quality, rest in that quality, or changing towards the contrary quality, like becoming black is contrary to becoming white.
Finally, he looks at the surprising number of ways we use the term to have. It's much broader than just physical possession.
It really is. It's a great example of how a single common word can actually span multiple categories depending on the context. It shows the flexibility, maybe even the ambiguity of language.
So you can have a habit or disposition.
Yes, like have knowledge or have virtue. That relates to the category of quality.
You can have a quantity.
Have a height of 3 cubits, that's clearly quantity.
You can have apparel, have a coat.
That falls into the category of state or have it in that specific sense. Same for having a ring on the hand.
What about having a hand or foot?
That's different. That's having something as a part of oneself, relating back to substance.
And having content, like a jar, has wine.
That sounds more like the relation of a container to what it contains.
Having something acquired, like have a house.
Also seems like the relation of an owner to property.
And what he calls the most remote meaning.
Having a wife or husband. He says this just signifies living together, a kind of relationship or state, but it's quite removed from the other senses. It's a fascinating list.
It really is. So, wrapping this up, what does this all mean? We've journeyed through Aristotle's incredible foundational attempt to map reality and language.
A truly ambitious project.
He starts with how words relate to things, identifies the ultimate subjects of existence and primary substances,
The bedrock individuals.
and then gives us these 10 fundamental ways to describe anything that exists from its core nature, its quantity, its quality, its relations, all the way to its place, time, position, state, actions, affections.
A comprehensive system for predication.
We've seen how he rigorously sorts different types of opposition, correlatives, contraries, privatives, affirmations, negations, and clarifies how we order things using concepts like prior and simultaneous in ways that go beyond just time.
It's a powerful toolkit for thinking precisely about the world, and importantly, about the words we use to describe it.
It really makes you pause and consider the basic structure underlying everything we experience and discuss. Think about this final point. Aristotle makes this hard distinction between a substance like an individual person, which can undergo change while remaining the same fundamental thing,
Right, the subject persists through change.
and then qualities like generous or tall, which are things had by the substance and can vary in degree, or relations like taller than, which depend entirely on something else for their definition.
That core distinction between the enduring subject and its changeable or relational attributes is key.
So how does this fundamental way of slicing up reality, this focus on what a thing is versus its attributes and relations, how might that influence how you approach analyzing things today, whether it's scientific classification, understanding personal identity over time, or even just describing complex systems in business or society? Where do you see the value or maybe the limitations of thinking in these Aristotelian categories? Something for you to mull over.